On a cold night in 1947, a Soviet colonel stood at the edge of a broken city and decided to change sides in the most dangerous way possible. His name was Grigorii Aleksandrovich Tokaev. On paper, he was a loyal officer, a decorated engineer, a man entrusted with Stalin's secrets in aviation and rockets. In reality, he was done. Done with the terror, done with the lies, done with a system that used his genius but did not allow him to be a free man. He walked away from the Soviet zone of Berlin and into the British sector, carrying something far more valuable than any briefcase of documents: the knowledge inside his head of how the Soviet Union intended to build the weapons of the future. To understand what that meant, you have to understand who Grigorii Tokaev was before that night. He was born in 1909 in the Terek region in the North Caucasus, in a world that was collapsing. The Russian Empire was dying. Civil war ripped the country apart. Hunger and chaos were normal. Like many from the new generation, he saw science and the communist project as a way out of that chaos. He was ambitious, intelligent, and technically gifted. Those talents brought him into the very heart of the Soviet aviation establishment. As a young man, Tokaev entered the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy, the most prestigious aeronautical school in the Soviet Union. It was the place where the future of Soviet aviation was designed. By 1938, he was no longer just a student, he was the head of the Academy's Aeronautics Laboratory. In that role, he supervised research into aerodynamics, high-speed flight, and the emerging ideas that would later become rocket-assisted aircraft and guided missiles. In 1941, he completed his doctorate in technical sciences, something that only a handful of people in his field achieved at that time. He was not only a scientist, he was also a soldier and a party man. During the Second World War, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Zhukovsky Academy was evacuated east to Sverdlovsk to escape the German advance. But Tokaev did not sit safely in the rear for the entire war. As the front stabilized, he returned to Moscow. He even flew bombing missions over Stalingrad in American Lend-Lease aircraft, putting his technical knowledge to use as a frontline officer. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the Red Army. He taught by day, worked on aircraft design by night, and flew combat sorties when needed. He was an engineer with blood on his hands and experience under fire. By the end of the war, his importance in the Soviet system had grown even further. He held not one, but two high-level positions. He remained a senior figure at the Zhukovsky Academy. At the same time, he was head of the aviation department at the Moscow Engineering Institute. In that capacity, he supervised work on advanced research topics, including the feasibility of medium-range winged rockets, projects that were years ahead of what most of the world imagined. He was also a trusted Communist Party representative at these institutions, acting both as a scientist and as the party's eyes and ears among the technical elite. Then came 1945. Nazi Germany collapsed. The Red Army occupied Berlin. The world map was being redrawn. Tokaev was sent to Berlin as part of the Soviet Control Commission. He worked under legendary commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Vasily Sokolovsky. He had access to communications between the Soviet General Staff and the Kremlin. He saw how Stalin was thinking about post-war Europe. His job included evaluating German aeronautical technology and rocket developments, advising Soviet commanders and planners on what could be seized, copied, or adapted. In Germany, Tokaev saw two things at once. On one side, he saw what German engineers had accomplished under pressure: advanced aerodynamics, swept-wing designs, jet engines, and of course the V-2 rocket, the world's first operational ballistic missile. In reality, he saw the Soviet system approach those technologies. The goal was not cooperation, not open science, but wholesale appropriation and militarization. Soviet officers carted off German scientists and hardware. Massive efforts began to reverse engineer and surpass what German industry had achieved. Tokaev knew he was standing at the dawn of a new age, an age of rockets and missiles that would reach far beyond the battlefield. If this were just a story about a talented engineer in a powerful state, it would end there. But somewhere along the way, Tokaev stopped believing. He had survived Stalin's purges. He had served through the war. He had done everything the system asked. But he had also seen what that system did to people. He had seen friends disappear. He had heard stories from the camps. He had watched the machinery of terror up close. And in the mid-1940s, he began to think that the Soviet future was not what he wanted to serve. Later in life, he claimed he was part of a small, clandestine anti-Stalin circle in the military and academic world, a group that dreamed of reforming the system from within. But after the war, instead of reforms, he saw Stalin tighten his grip again. New purges were launched. Ideological control became harsher. People with independent minds were once again marked as potential enemies. For someone like Tokaev, whose work and rank made him visible, it was a warning sign.
The crisis point came in 1947. After his stint in Berlin, he was recalled to the Soviet Union. According to accounts later cited by British sources, he learned that SMERSH, the feared military counterintelligence organization, was preparing to arrest him, his wife Azabayeva, and their small daughter. Whether the charges would have been real or invented hardly mattered. In Stalin's system, an arrest was almost always the same thing: interrogation under torture until you confessed to something, followed by the camp or the firing squad. Tokaev understood the pattern. He knew that being on a list at SMERSH was as good as being condemned. He had a choice. He could go back and hope that his rank and his usefulness would save him, or he could do something almost unthinkable: defect to the West. For a Soviet colonel with access to top-secret projects, defection was not just betrayal, it was a death sentence for anyone left behind. It was a guarantee that the state would hunt him down in its own way for the rest of his life. It was also the only way he could see to protect his family from immediate arrest. In 1947, in the shattered remains of Berlin, he made his move. Still officially part of the Soviet apparatus, he slipped across the line from the Soviet zone into the British sector. He did not just walk up to any checkpoint. He had to evade Soviet internal controls, identify the right British officers, and convince them that he was who he said he was: a senior Soviet engineer, a lieutenant colonel, someone with real access and not a plant. For the British, the risk was high. They knew the Soviets ran deception operations, but they also knew what it would mean if this man was genuine. From the first debriefings, it became clear that he was very real and very valuable. He knew the internal structure of the Zhukovsky Academy and other top research institutes. He knew which German technologies the Soviets considered valuable and how they were planning to adapt them. He understood the early conceptual work on long-range rockets and guided missiles. And he knew something else, something that resonated with British and American fears. He knew that the Soviet leadership had decided that rockets were not just toys or experiments, they were a strategic weapon, and their planned targets were not just European cities, but eventually places like London and New York. One authoritative Cold War reference later summed up the significance of what he said this way: Colonel Grigorii Tokaev, an aeronautical engineer who defected to Britain in 1947, revealed that the Soviet Politburo had decided to develop a long-range rocket capable of striking the United States. Before that, Western analysts had suspected that Soviet planners were thinking this way. After Tokaev, they knew. His testimony helped shift Soviet rockets from being seen as a theoretical possibility to a looming strategic reality. In intelligence terms, this was the kind of defection every service dreams of, a technically sophisticated insider with high clearance who is ideologically disillusioned and willing to talk in detail. Tokaev gave the British a map of Soviet aviation and rocket research. He described the chain of command from laboratories to ministries to the Kremlin. He identified key personalities. He explained how Soviet planners thought about combining aircraft and rockets, about using German work as a springboard, and about the timelines they saw for developing serious long-range capabilities. For the West, and especially for the United States, information like this helped shape early Cold War strategy. It reinforced the idea that the Soviet Union was not going to be satisfied with a defensive posture. It was planning for offensive capabilities that could project power across continents. It also underscored the importance of staying ahead technologically. If the Soviets were building a ballistic rocket that could reach America, then America would have to invest in missile defense, early warning, and a strategic nuclear deterrent of its own. At the same time, Tokaev's defection carried an important psychological message. Here was a man who had been shaped by the Soviet system from the beginning, given every opportunity, entrusted with major responsibilities, and yet, when it came down to a choice between that system and the West, he ran to the British. He did not go to another dictatorship. He did not try to disappear into some neutral place. He went directly into the arms of a Western democracy and offered his knowledge as a way to fight the regime he had once served. Once he was safely in Britain, Tokaev's story took a different turn. Unlike some defectors who remained in the shadows, he eventually stepped into public life. After the initial secret debriefings, after the intelligence reports and closed-door sessions, he reinvented himself as a public intellectual and academic. Under the slightly altered name Grigorii Tokaev, he began lecturing in London on aeronautics and later on space technology. In 1951, he published a book under the name Colonel G.A. Tokaev called Stalin Means War. The title itself was a declaration. At a moment when some people in the West still entertained the idea that the Soviet Union might settle into a peaceful coexistence, Tokaev argued the opposite. He drew on his experience in the Soviet system to claim that Stalin's regime was inherently aggressive, that its ideology required expansion, and its armament and rocket programs were driven by a deliberate plan to prepare for global confrontation. Readers did not just see a polemic, they saw a man who had been there, a former Soviet colonel and rocket engineer, a party representative at the top military engineering academy. When he wrote that Stalin was preparing for war, it carried a weight that a Western commentator could never match. The book circulated widely in policy circles. It was read by politicians, generals, and analysts trying to understand what kind of adversary the United States and its allies were facing.
In the later 1950s and 1960s, Tokaev became a professor in Britain. He eventually took up a leading role at what would become City, University of London. The university itself, looking back on its history, later described him as a former chief rocket scientist of the USSR who had switched sides and brought his expertise on aeronautics and space into a British academic setting. He turned his deep technical knowledge into lectures and courses for students who would go on to build the next generation of aircraft and space systems, not for Stalin, but for the free world. Imagine what that actually meant in practice. In the Soviet Union, his students would have been future designers for state ministries, working on projects shielded by secrecy, driven by political orders, destined to be used primarily in war. In Britain, his students had a different horizon. Yes, some would go into military or defense work, but others would move into civil aviation, commercial aerospace, and scientific research. His knowledge was being channeled into a system where technology did not just serve the state, it served a broader society. That contrast lies at the heart of why stories like Tokaev's matter to an American audience. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were both racing into the same future: jets, missiles, nuclear weapons, and eventually space. Both sides had brilliant engineers and scientists. Both sides had access to German research and their own innovators. But the systems they worked under were radically different. On the Soviet side, engineers like Tokaev operated in a world where one wrong conversation could mean arrest, where failure was not just a setback, but potentially a crime, where being too independent-minded made you suspect, where the ultimate purpose of your work was decided in secret by a small circle at the top, and where that purpose was almost always military dominance and political control. On the American side, engineers often worked in government programs, but they also worked in private industry, universities, and open research environments. They published, they debated, they competed, they could quit and go somewhere else. They lived in a system that was messy, sometimes inefficient, but profoundly dynamic. The same environment that produced weapons also produced airliners, communications satellites, medical devices, and technologies that transformed daily life. For someone like Grigorii Tokaev, that difference was not theoretical, it was personal. He had lived through Stalin's terror. He had watched brilliant colleagues disappear. He understood that the Soviet state did not trust its own talent, it feared it. When he crossed into the British sector in 1947, he was not just changing employers, he was changing which kind of future his work would support. His defection also gave American policymakers another kind of confidence. If a high-ranking Soviet rocket scientist could look at his own system and decide it was hopelessly wrong, then American leaders could be more certain that their own model, imperfect as it was, had real strengths. When they chose to invest in things like the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics and later NASA, when they poured resources into universities and research labs, when they encouraged competition among companies designing jets and missiles, they were betting on freedom as a force multiplier. Defectors like Tokaev were living evidence that this bet made sense. Think about the timeline. In 1947, when Tokaev defected, there were no ICBMs, no satellites, no manned space flights. Rockets were still crude, often unreliable machines. By the early 1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had orbiting satellites, intercontinental missiles, and were sending humans into space. In those 15 years, the technical world that Tokaev knew in 1947 exploded into a new era.
On the Soviet side, that explosion was driven by state-directed programs, extraordinary feats of engineering under political pressure, and a propaganda machine that presented each success as proof of communist superiority. On the American side, it was driven by a mixture of government projects and private innovation, by the pressure of competition with the USSR, and by internal demands for progress. When Americans watched Soviet achievements like Sputnik and Gagarin's flight, they were shocked, but they also responded by doubling down on their own strengths: education, industry, and open science. Tokaev, living quietly in Britain, watched this unfold. He saw the Soviet advances in rockets and spaceflight, knowing from his own experience how much sacrifice and fear lay behind those achievements. He saw American advances as well, and he saw something else, that the technologies the United States developed tended to spill over into civilian life in a way that Soviet technologies rarely did. One system built missiles and also built a world of commercial jets, global communications, and consumer electronics. The other built missiles and produced shortages, secret cities, and a population trained to hide what they really thought. In the end, his life arc tells you who won that race. He died in 2003 in a London suburb, not in a Soviet apartment block.
He spent half a century teaching and writing in the West. He used his knowledge to help shape a world where science could be debated openly and where engineers did not have to fear a knock at the door in the middle of the night. The system he fled collapsed under its own contradictions. The system he joined not only survived, but kept innovating. Grigorii Tokaev's story is not as famous as some other Cold War tales. There are no dramatic airport photographs or televised hearings. His defection happened in the shadows of a divided city. His war was fought with technical reports and lecture notes more than with headlines. But for those who understood what he brought with him, the details of early Soviet rocket plans, the confirmation of Stalin's aggressive intentions, the insider view of how the Soviet military-industrial complex really worked, he was a key figure. For Americans today, looking back at the Cold War, his life is a reminder of why the United States and its allies ultimately had the edge. It was not just that the West built better rockets or more powerful bombs. It was that the West built an environment where someone like Tokaev could choose to bring his knowledge across the line, where that knowledge could be tested and challenged rather than simply obeyed, and where the same engineering mind that once served a dictatorship could spend the rest of its life teaching in a free society. That is the kind of story that makes the Cold War more than an abstract contest between superpowers. It makes it a story about real people, about their choices, and about the systems that inspired those choices. Grigorii Tokaev's defection in 1947 was one of the first cracks in the wall of Soviet secrecy around rockets and aviation. It helped the West understand what was coming. It helped shape American responses, and it stands as one more piece of evidence that when the brightest minds inside the Soviet machine looked up and saw which direction history was moving, they turned, whenever they could, toward the free world.